The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka was a German dive bomber and ground attack aircraft. It became a propaganda symbol of German air power of the so-called Blitzkrieg victories. Despite the Stuka's vulnerability to enemy fighters having been exposed during the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had no choice but to continue its development as there was no replacement aircraft in sight. The result of this development was the D series, which featured two radiators underneath the inboard sections of the wings and introduced a refined cockpit with better visibility and space. The D-3 was a version with more armor for its ground attack role. One of the most interesting test programs concerned one Junkers Ju-87 D-3 fitted with large, streamlined overwing passenger cabins. The idea was that the Ju-87, an aircraft still used for frontline operations late in the war, should become a vehicle for putting down agents behind the front lines. The trial program got underway in early 1944, and the final design of cabin seated two men in tandem, both facing forward, with ample side windows which gave the pilot some lateral vision. It is important to note that between the summer of 1940 and the spring of 1941, the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, attempted to insert a number of agents into Great Britain. Some were sent by boat, others were sent by aircraft. Agents dropped were usually transported to England by a Heinkel 111 medium bomber. These agent-dropping missions were usually led by Captain Karl Edmund Gartenfeld, one of the most experienced reconnaissance pilots of the Luftwaffe. In the 1944 experiment, each pod could carry two men, so one Stuka could have delivered a four-man agent or sabotage team behind the enemy lines. In a shallow dive, these two pods were to be pulled off the wing by large parachutes, but there is no record of this actually being done, although the pods were actually flown with passengers. Considering the relatively short range of the Stuka aircraft compared with the medium bombers, it seems that the aim was to insert a large number of agents behind the Soviet front line on the Eastern Front. The agent-dropping Stuka was never used in action, but the concept was not fully abandoned. In early 1944, a very unusual object was manufactured in an aircraft plant in the Austrian city of Wiener Neustadt. The object was cigar-shaped and had a metal frame. It was called the Personen Abwurf Gerät, or the person dropping device. By the beginning of 1944, the Red Army was already close to complete liberation of Ukraine. The German High Command desperately needed tactical information and was trying to increase the number of its spies. However, an increase in the number of deployed agents inevitably affects the time frame and quality of their training, including the parachute training. Delivery vehicles also began to pose a significant technical problem, namely the bombers, in particular the previously mentioned Heinkel 111, was not fast enough to survive an encounter with the enemy fighters. Faster German aircraft were poorly suited or not suitable at all for agent dropping. In this late stage of the war, the agent teams could involve women, teenagers, and elderly. This gave rise to yet another set of problems. In addition to the already mentioned poor parachute training, the problem was that these agents were so frightened that they often refused to leave the plane. So, with each group, a German intelligence officer came on board who not only monitored the accuracy of the drop, but also, if necessary, pushed the paratroopers out of the last moment of the plane. Plus, there could be problems after the landing as well. For example, the group could have been scattered by the wind to different points and they could get hurt or twisted their leg when landing. In the case of a drop with large equipment set, there was a risk of losing it or delaying the start of the operation due to its search on the ground. At the beginning of 1944, a German officer proposed creating a special landing container inside which agents with all the necessary equipment would be placed. As planned, this capsule would be suspended on standard bomb racks or instead of additional fuel tanks. Only 3 weeks passed from the first sketches to the release of the first samples, and a batch of about 30 containers was urgently manufactured and intended for testing. It is difficult to talk about mass production, but it was planned to produce approximately 200 containers per month. The length of the device was approximately 4.5 meters, and the diameter was about 1.5 meters. The load capacity was 500 kilograms, of which 3 people with equipment weighed 100 kilograms. The remaining 200 were in the luggage compartment. The agents' legs rested on a special pillow and their bodies were fastened to the hammocks with clasps. Overhead there was a compartment with 4 folded parachutes. These containers were hung on planes like regular bombs. To communicate between the saboteurs and the aircraft crew during the flight, telephone communication was provided, and it was also possible to open the ventilation valves to purify the internal space. While above the landing area, the responsible crew member activated the release mechanism, after which the container began to free fall. A steel cable was attached to the head of the container, which at the other end was also attached to the fuselage of the aircraft. When the maximum length was reached, the cable tore off the detachable cap and released the parachutes. After the release, they automatically opened, stabilizing the container in space to a descent speed of 7 meters per sec. At the same time, the agents who were inside lowered themselves to the ground with their feet down on a shock-absorbing footing element, thereby reducing the risk of damaging their legs. The landing was much softer than a parachute jump. But the landing container and the whole concept did not guarantee 100% protection. The agents were not provided with oxygen masks and warm clothing. Thus, there is a known case when the aircraft escaping from an enemy fighter gained a high altitude and the agents were lost due to hypothermia. The built-in telephone did not help them either. The bomber crew simply did not pick up the phone. The lack of armor carried the risk of being killed by anti-aircraft guns or fighters, and if the container was damaged, its passengers who did not have parachutes had no chance of salvation. But, despite all of this, the tests were considered successful and the containers were used in special operations on the Eastern Front in the last year of the war. Approximately 200 to 300 agents were thrown behind enemy lines using this method. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss my future work, please make sure you are subscribed to my channel and press the bell notification button. Thank you and see you in the next video.